you probably already know that the main function of the heart is to pump blood through our circulatory system. So the blood comes in, it gets pumped, it comes in deoxygenated, that's why it's colored blue here. Then it gets pumped out to the lungs, it gets oxygenated in the lungs, then it comes back into the heart to get pumped out to the rest of the body, so to make sure that the oxygen is distributed. Now, whenever someone talks about heart disease and eventually heart attacks, a lot of times people talk about clogged arteries. And when I first heard that when I was a kid, I assumed that, hey, the heart is this pump and it has these arteries that are supplying blood to the rest of the body. That must be what people are talking about when they talk about clogged arteries. Maybe some type of clogging forms in these really big arteries over here, and at some point they get so big that the blood can't flow through them, and then the person dies. And that's what I used to think what a heart attack was when I was a kid. But this is not the case. This is not the case. When people talk about coronary artery disease, or when they talk about clogged arteries, they're not talking about these big arteries or the big veins that are going to or away from the heart. They're actually talking about the smaller arteries that are actually supplying blood to the heart. So when people talk about coronary artery disease, or when they're talking about clogged arteries, not these big pipes, they're talking about the supply of blood to the heart. So the first thing when people talk about kind of clogged arteries, the official thing they're referring to is atherosclerosis. Fancy word, but all it really means is, let me show you, atherosclerosis. And I'm not going to go into the details of how these arterial walls actually thicken. I could probably do a couple of videos on that. But the general idea, if this is an artery over here, over time you have these plaques develop. You have these plaques develop inside of the arterial wall, and they restrict the amount of blood that can flow through the artery. And these plaques, these are kind of combinations. These plaques right here are combinations of lipids. So lipids are things like cholesterols and fats, and you also have a bunch of white blood cells in here. So you also have white blood cells. Many of them might be dead. White blood cells. So over time, these plaques can kind of build up in the artery, start to restrict the flow of blood through the artery. And if these get thick enough and they restrict the flow of blood, this is what we call coronary artery disease. Let me write that down. Coronary artery disease. And the main symptom that someone would experience if they have coronary artery disease. So I want to make it very clear what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about these big pipes. I'm not talking about these big pipes that go into or away from the heart. I'm talking about the arteries that supply blood to the actual muscles of the heart. Remember, the heart is made up of muscles. It needs blood itself to do the pumping. It needs oxygen itself. So what you can imagine happens in one of these arteries that supply blood to the heart, right over here, and just so you know some of these names, you might hear them thrown around. This on the left-hand side on the red, let me label it over here, this in red over here, this is the left coronary artery, sometimes called the LCA. And you might say, wait, this is the one on the right, but we're thinking about it from the point of view of the person whose heart it is. So that's why it's their left coronary artery. This right here is the right coronary artery. And these are the ones, or some branches off of them, that might have thickening of the walls. So what you imagine, this plaque could form, maybe it's forming right over here. Let me do that in a different color. Maybe it's forming right over here. And so when you have this plaque form right over here, what it's going to do is it's going to reduce blood flow to all of these parts. Let me draw that a little bit neater. It'll reduce blood flow to all of this kind of downstream part of the artery. And because it's reducing blood flow, all of the muscle around here, all of the muscle that gets its oxygen, that's fed oxygen from kind of the downstream part of the artery, they won't get enough oxygen and they won't be able to pump properly. And so the main symptom of coronary artery disease is called angina pectoris. You might have, so angina pectoris. and it's usually just called angina for short. But angina pectoris literally means a strangling-like feeling in the chest. And you get that strangling-like feeling in the chest because your heart is not getting enough oxygen to pump properly. But at this point, you still don't have a heart attack. A heart attack happens where one of these plaques are unstable enough, so they might have a little membrane covering the top of it, but they're unstable enough so that they eventually, because of the blood flow and the pressure from the blood, they eventually break off. So they eventually break off and go into the blood. So then you have all of the material enters in the blood, and then the blood actually clots around it. And so the blood actually clots around it. So here the blood is clotting around all of these materials. So you had a plaque, now it was unstable, and so at some point it just randomly breaks off. All of this blood clots around this, and then it's going downstream. It's going downstream where the arteries get thinner and thinner and thinner. So you can imagine if this thing right here was unstable, it could get dislodged over there. Let me do this in a color we can see. It gets dislodged over there. You still can't see that color. It gets dislodged over there, and if it goes downstream, the arteries get narrower and narrower, and at some point it'll get stuck in a thinner part of the artery. So it'll go downstream until it gets stuck, and at that point it's completely blocking that artery. And this completely blocking of the artery from a kind of a blood clot that came off of one of these unstable plaques, this is called thrombosis. So this right here is thrombosis. So it's the blocking of an artery due to a plaque. But once you block that artery, then none of the muscles that artery was feeding can now get oxygen.